Good afternoon and welcome. It's very good. Glad that you're here for this conversation. My name is John Witvliet of the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, and it's a joy and honor to interview this afternoon Doug Brouwer. Doug is a veteran pastor. He's a longtime member of our Worship Grants Advisory Board. He is a graduate of Calvin College, author of some wonderful books, a book on Christian doctrine, a book on marriage, a book on cross-cultural ministry. We'll have a chance to draw on all these things, but it's also our chance to say thank you and to learn from Doug's insight and wisdom as he completes what is about, 18 years of service on our Worship Grants Advisory Board. So Doug probably has read 15, 16, 1,700 applications for grants. And just that exercise alone offers us a rich vein of insights to explore. Will you please join me in actually saying thank you to Doug and welcoming Doug to our conversation. We're going to be exploring themes as was advertised around pastoral imagination. But as we get started, Doug, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about your journey, because pastoral wisdom is so tied and connected to place, to locality. So could you sort of paint a picture for us? Imagine that we had a map in front of us and take us to the places in which you've had an opportunity to serve.
Yeah, thank you, John. Your words this afternoon and last night are generous and gracious. I appreciate them very much. I grew up not more than 2 miles from Calvin's campus, and I guess it was preordained that I would become a student here, and I'm happy to say I'm a graduate of Calvin. I then went to Princeton Seminary, so I had a brief sojourn on the East Coast and started my ministry in the Presbyterian Church in the East. But I came back to the Midwest. I have strong Midwestern roots and probably feel most comfortable in this part of the country. And I had my longest stretch of ministry in Wheaton, Illinois, First Presbyterian Church of Wheaton, and it was a generative time of ministry. A great deal happened. That's the time I came to know John, and I think there was a Colam worship conference actually brought us together. Our church hosted an early version of the symposium there. From Wheaton, I went to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and served the First Presbyterian Church there. And then my last U.S. stop was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And I reached my late 50s and thought, okay, I can continue to do this. I know how to serve mostly white, mostly suburban churches, Presbyterian churches. But I think I'm ready for a challenge, something that will keep me going to the end of my active ministry. And this is an example of be careful what you pray for, because at that point I accepted a call to the International Protestant Church in Zurich, Switzerland. And so my last 5 years were spent in what was not a white, not a suburban, not a Presbyterian church. In fact, I think we'll get into some of this later. But on any given Sunday morning in that particular church, there were 26 nationalities, at least that many language groups available, so I was suddenly plunged into a situation that I was not at all prepared for. So that's the brief story.
No doubt we'll have a chance to hear about many places along the way in the journey. But as we unpack the wisdom of this journey, I think we ought to celebrate right up front that there's a very special person in this room today. And Doug, I think you should introduce her. It's Doug's mom.
I was going to get around to this. Thanks, John. My mom is here. I feel like I'm in kindergarten, and my mom is supporting me, but she has been at all the big events in my life, and now at this retirement stage, here she is again. Mom, would you mind standing up?
That's wonderful. So the motif that we're going to reflect on together is this motif, pastoral imagination. It's a term that Craig Dykstra has introduced into literature about pastoral ministry. It's a very significant term because Craig was one of the key people that helped give rise, actually, to this grants program and to supporting the unique kind of pastoral imagination needed in local ministry. When Craig talks about pastoral imagination, he riffs in a way on the different kinds of intelligence that people need for different kinds of jobs. There's a certain mathematical intelligence, needed to be an accountant, or a kinesthetic intelligence, needed to be a soccer coach or a violin teacher. And he really had this conviction that there was a unique kind of pastoral intelligence that then he reframed as a pastoral imagination. What does that concept evoke in you? What are the things as you think about your journey, what is in that concept that particularly brings some key themes to life?
If you have not read about Pastoral Imagination, I encourage you to look it up and read about it. If you are a pastor or a ministry leader, I think that you will be energized by reading about this concept, because as you read about it, you'll discover that you are being described. Craig Dykstra has a way of describing who pastors are that is at once alarming and also very affirming. And just by way of background, Craig Dykstra for many years was vice president of the Lilly Endowment, and like John and the Worship Institute, I too have been on the receiving end of a great deal of financial encouragement from the Lilly Endowment, so I have enormous respect for what they do. So very briefly, Craig Dykstra would say that when he listens to a lawyer, for example, he discovers that a lawyer looks through the world through a particular lens and has developed a kind of vocabulary for describing the world that he or she sees. And I would say from my own experience that other professions have this same characteristic. Architects. Those times in my career when I've had the opportunity to work with architects, I've discovered that they see the world differently from the way we see it, and they have a different vocabulary for describing that world. So Craig Dykstra says, well, pastors have this unique quality too, and then he drills down and tries to describe what it is that makes pastors unique. And so in his mind, there is a constellation of characteristics and skills and gifts and so on, including training. But not just training, but training in both abstract cognitive disciplines, but also very practical disciplines. Pastors typically have a wealth of experience with people and systems. Pastors have been mentored in a particular way, and I'm probably leaving out a few other characteristics, but he said all of these come together to form a unique kind of person, and he has captured that in the expression pastoral imagination. So can I keep going with this? John already knows where I'm going to go with this. So as I've read those 1,800 grant applications over the years, the times when I would become most excited would be the times when I saw this gift in the project director or the grant writer. As a pastor, it was so obvious to me who had this particular set of experiences. So do you mind if I give an example here? I'll try to leave out names and cities. There was a chaplain, and I may cry a little bit as I tell this story. There was a chaplain at a children's hospital who found herself dealing with parents who would come a long distance to this hospital. It wasn't a primary care, it wasn't secondary, it was a tertiary care facility, and typically children did not get better who came to the hospital. So her work was helping the parents deal with what was happening at a very, very difficult, so hard to imagine time in their lives. And so she came to us with a proposal, I know you remember this one, a proposal about using Psalms to give these parents language to describe where they were spiritually. And I read this proposal, wept the first time, and I thought, number one, I want to meet her when she comes to the colloquium, and number two, she could be my pastor. You know, I would want to have a pastor with this kind of insight into who human beings are and what their spiritual needs are. Do you mind if I give one more example? A woman in ministry, a woman I think in upstate New York, her church burned. So she came to us with a grant proposal about having saved some charred wood, and I guess she saved some broken stained glass as well. But her grant proposal was about commissioning an artist from her neighborhood to fashion a cross. And from this cross, she managed to teach her congregation about resurrection. Right? There was never a doubt in her mind that this church had life beyond the fire. So to everyone else, this church looked as though it had come to the end of its life, but not in that pastor's mind. And the symbol of that new life was this charred cross refashioned it was a charred beam refashioned into a cross for that church's sanctuary. Well, once again, at the colloquium, I made a beeline to that pastor, and I said, I want to shake your hand. You know, I think the church is blessed because you are a part of it.
Love those stories, and there are several dozen right here in this building today that are like it too. So one of the things I'd love to talk about a little bit is how that pastoral imagination is learned or cultivated over time, the experiences along the way. If you think about that geographic journey that you described, that have honed or sharpened that. And I think, for example, there might be some people early on who might read those grant proposals and not recognize them as beautiful examples of a pastoral imagination, but then later on would say, oh yes. And so that's a really interesting question. What's the journey like from not recognizing the beauty of those to savoring and celebrating the beauty, that journey of learning? What shaped your own learning about that along the way?
You won't be surprised to hear me say this. I don't think pastors are fully formed when they receive their MDiv and graduate from seminary. I think key to new pastor's development is some good mentoring. And I'm going to say it just happened. I realize it wasn't coincidental, but I just happened to find myself mentored by a very gifted lead pastor. So for the first 5 years of my ministry, I followed this person around and was humble about what I didn't know after graduating from seminary. And I learned from him the basics. I mean, he led me through wedding rehearsals, and he led me through funerals, how to plan a service with a family, and how to lead a family through a difficult time, and countless other pastoral examples. And for the first couple of years, I did it the way Fred did it. I didn't know of another way to do it except to follow Fred's example. But as time went by, I began to build on what Fred had shown me about how to do pastoral ministry. So I think the very beginning would be the educational component and the experience, and then the mentoring. And I'm just a grateful recipient of the people in my life who've shaped my pastoral identity.
Are there ways in which, if you think about those different congregations, those congregations taught you in certain ways where you think, oh, now that Wheaton Church, they taught me, or the Ann Arbor Church, or Fort Lauderdale, or certain ways that learning might have unfolded?
I mean, every pastor or ministry leader here will recognize that. Our congregations teach us how they want to be loved. Right? And they know us better than we think they do. They see our weaknesses and they decide to love us anyway. And I think the example I would use is not Wheaton so much as the church where I spent a year-long internship between my second and third years of seminary. I didn't show much promise for ministry. I have to say, my first sermon, this was in Iowa. I went as far away from home as I could get, or as far away as I could imagine being at that time, because I didn't want anyone to see me starting out. And my first sermon in that church, I think, was, I prepared it to be a normal length, and I had received training in how to preach. But my first sermon, I think, was about 7 minutes. And I think I could see people glancing at their watches, thinking, wow, that went pretty fast. And then years later, I spoke to my mentor about that first time out, and he said, I thought about standing up and saying, why don't you do that again, Doug? Maybe there was something we didn't get the first time. But what I learned from that congregation, the serious part of that story, is that they showered me with grace. And I learned from them what grace means. I mean, they overlooked all of that amateurishness that I brought to them, and they believed that somewhere in there was a pastor waiting to be born. I will always be grateful to them.
God bless every church that has that kind of grace. Yeah? Amen? Yeah, it's a beautiful. Yeah. Along the way, one of the things that you've contributed a lot have been thoughtful, pastorally oriented writings. And it's occurred to me that this discipline of being a writer while you are a pastor, I'm guessing not only sharpened your own instincts, your own pastoral imagination, some of us, I think, write in order to think, but also have blessed so many other people. So could you say a little bit about that vocation of writing while in ministry and what that's meant and the role it's played in your own life?
Interesting that you should put it that way. I write in order to understand, or I write in order to know what I think about something. I mean, that is my story. I've known children over the years. My own daughters would not be an example of this, but sometimes children have a very difficult time expressing what they're feeling. But if you put a piece of paper in front of them and some crayons, they can give you an eloquent statement of exactly how they're feeling. Well, I'm not an artist, but I can write. So often I write so that I can figure something out. And the earliest example of this would be the book I wrote about marriage. I found myself, this was again in the Wheaton Church, I was officiating at a marriage a week. And I realized that I was part of the wedding industrial complex in the U.S. And I wanted to know what was going on. I mean, what am I supposed to think about this? What's really happening in all of these ceremonies? So I began to read and reflect, and I spoke to other people who had more experience than I had. And that is what led to my book. It was an effort to understand what marriage is about. So there are chapters about covenant and sacraments and so on, but all of it was for my own, ultimately for my own benefit. And then I'll give you one last example about that. Early on in my time in Zurich, I realized that I was over my head in terms of the multicultural atmosphere of that church. And so once again, what do I do? Well, I can't draw a picture, but I can write this out. I can make sense of it by beginning to write chapters describing my experience. So that book was an attempt to help myself out, right? And I hope that there are a few other people who are in multicultural settings who will see themselves in my experience.
Let's actually follow up on that and go into that book a little bit. Some of the key themes. What are things that, once you got to the end, maybe surprised you, or you surprised yourself? What about the nature of ministry in that context? I think what a unique setting that has to be when when it truly is global yet brought together in a city like Zurich. So.
I mean, the tendency, for me anyway, I don't know if anyone else here shares this, but the tendency is to think, I know how this works. I know what it means to be a pastor. I had done it for 35 years, and actually at that point in my ministry, I thought, well, there isn't anything I haven't seen, or there is no situation I can't think my way through. And then suddenly, I was in a situation where I hadn't seen everything. And every conversation was a challenge. Every time I talked with someone, I had to think, am I really understanding you? Or is there a cultural gap here that we need to bridge somehow? So, okay. So in those situations, as in my first situation as an intern, I think the key for me was to approach it in humility. Well, I don't know everything about this, and I've never met a person from, you name the country, or I've never met a person. I don't know how they think, so I need to be a very careful listener in this situation. So I think that book was born of, more than anything, born of humility. I'm in over my head.
Mm-hmm. Suppose now that you are going to mentor a younger pastor, and explore how that would go, how just that insight about listening might factor into your mentorship of someone else? I mean, how do you learn the love of listening? That's a tough one. Any thoughts about that?
John, you're not here yet, but you may be very soon. I think the temptation for a person at my stage of life is to think, I have an abundance of wisdom, and now I'm going to pour it out for everyone I come across. I'm going to tell you how ministry works. And I know enough to know that that's not how it works. That's not what people are looking for from me. I think there's a proverb, and I didn't learn, I memorized plenty of scripture, but I didn't learn chapters and verses. But there is a proverb which encourages us to put blessing before wisdom. Right? And I've taken that to heart, especially at this point in my life. I think that my calling or vocation at this point in my life is to offer plenty of blessing. And I founded a church home in Holland. When I'm not preaching elsewhere, I'm there. And I think my vocation here in this church is to bless this pastor, to find ways to be encouraging, to be available when that's needed. And then if she asks for my opinion about something, of course, I'm more than ready to offer my experience to her. But I think the starting point must be the offering of blessing. And I think younger, newer pastors are hungry to receive a blessing. So I had a staff member in my Zurich church who was a relatively new pastor, and I think he told me the first week how he wanted to be mentored. Right? He said, "I need to know what I do well." I said, "Okay," and so I think I made it my role in the relationship to say, you're really good at that. I wish I had been as good as you are at that. So I think that's where the relationship began. And then later, he would occasionally ask me questions about what I thought about certain situations, but that would not have been possible had he not known that I really believed in him and his gifts for ministry.
Beautiful. Let's reflect a little bit about worship in the journey along the way, public worship practices, and I'm thinking now of all these grand applications that we've read together and talked about for several years, and the gathering we're a part of now. How have your own thoughts about worship changed along the way? And if Doug Brouwer now could speak to a young Doug Brouwer as a pastor about worship, what would you say?
I have no idea how to answer that. Oh my goodness. So what you need to know about me, I guess, is that I grew out of a very traditional worship style. My earliest experiences in the church are with very traditional worship styles. So every step I've made away from that has been a kind of a journey. Okay, I know what I know, and I know what I like, but I've had to move. And I've had to leave what was comfortable for me, but because of my personal style, I have to think through each of those steps. And I'll just say that the Worship Institute has been very, very helpful. And the kind of worship we experience in the chapel at these events, the kind of worship we experience at the symposium are enormously helpful. They provide a window for how worship can be. Right? Here's what I know. But there are other ways to do this, other avenues to explore.
And you really, as you answered that, you really were getting at this dynamic of what does it mean to change? And as a grants board, that's something we talk a lot about. Is there evidence in this grant proposal that this community will be changing in a healthy way? And I think about some proposals which give the impression of some single person trying to impose their vision on a community. That actually comes through quite clearly often. And others which give evidence of real healthy self-awareness about the challenges related to change. And we were talking earlier that it's really one of the themes of this event, how to lead healthy change well. What would be your reflections on that big ministry challenge? How to lead healthy change well? And I'm even think about your comments about how, leading yourself through that is part of it along the way. but other examples that come to mind from your ministry or grant application insights you had about that?
I think whenever I've gone to a church thinking that I know better about something, that is the first step toward failure. So whenever change has been introduced, I've never presumed that I know better than anyone else about how this ought to be done. So I've always tried to align myself, not always. In the best situations, I've tried to align myself with the congregation, and I've invited them into the process of thinking through where we need to go. That's where the success has occurred. But it can be disastrous to think I know better about where this church ought to be.
A lot of that, too, depends on, I'm thinking of the relationships among staff and other leaders in the church, and a theme that we're certainly exploring in this conference and our time together are the importance of collegiality, of candor, of a willingness to really become a part of a team. Say a little bit about that part of your journey along the way.
So I'll take the first part of that first. I think that tenure builds credibility. I know I'm not the first person to have that insight, but the longer I stayed at the Wheaton Church, for example, the more the people there were willing to trust me and to go along with my cockeyed ideas. And so I reached the point where I had to, how do I say this? I didn't want to abuse that trust. I think that there was a certain point in the ministry there after 10 years or so where they were willing to do anything I suggested because we had some remarkable success there. But then I had to step back and say, well, I don't want to abuse the trust they're placing in me. Is this really the right direction for us to go? And then staff relationships. Oh my goodness, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. If you don't cultivate the relationships with staff members, your colleagues in ministry, I don't see how it's possible to do much effective ministry. And one of the reasons, I'll repeat something I said last night, one of the reasons that my work with the Worship Institute has been so satisfying is that there's such evidence of healthy collegial relationships. People respect each other's gifts. People don't hesitate to speak about those gifts. They point them out. And if we in our church settings can find a healthy situation like that, there's probably no limit to what we can introduce.
Mm-hmm. I also think over the years, this is a little window now into when you get 6, 8, 10, 12 people in the room, depending on the context. From our grants board staff, we're reviewing a stack of 150 grants, let's say. We don't always agree. I mean, there are some very vigorous disagreements that set in about, and I'm thinking about what it's like as people read these proposals from the perspective of being a pastor, others as musicians, others as teachers, the different lenses that we bring to each of these things. But then some of the most significant differences actually emerge over, is there the capacity in this grant? Is there evidence of a genuine spirit of collaboration? And I mean, it does strike me that especially in many churches, the relationship between the person who preaches the sermon and the person who leads the music, that in so many places, that particular relationship is right at the kernel of whether it will be a healthy worshiping community or not. Any particular learning about that unique challenge, in part because it's week in, week out, that dynamic?
I forget how many years ago it was now, but I brought the music director from Wheaton to co-lead a seminar at the symposium. And I thought our biggest gift in the seminar was to demonstrate what a healthy pastor-music leader relationship looks like. I don't think what we said was as important as what we demonstrated interpersonally. I had enormous respect for her gifts as a musician. I think she had some respect for me as a pastor, and that was the starting point. It began out of a feeling of mutual respect. Go ahead.
Okay. There's many more aspects to that theme we could. The direction I'd like to go is this. pastoral imagination is expressed through cultivating healthy staff relationships. It's cultivated and expressed in the preparation of the sermon. It's cultivated in that preparation for a marriage that you referred to earlier, in the humility and that cross-cultural encounter. So many different examples all week long. Here's one particular moment I'd like to focus on, and it's the moment of leading public prayer. The prayers of the people, pastoral prayer, that public act of praying, and the different dimensions of a pastor's awareness that need to go into that. Reflections on that, about the way that sort of brings together so many different themes in a pastor's work?
Yeah, there are probably several observations I could make about that. My most recent experience with that prayer in the context of worship was at my Zurich church, but the pastors never prayed that prayer. The elders were invited to pray the pastoral prayer. And I have to say, those were remarkable experiences. So these were voices from all over the world, from Africa and Asia and elsewhere in Europe. And so I would sit up front listening to my elders pray for the staff. They never failed to mention me by name in prayer, but they prayed for the other leaders of the church. They prayed for the world. And then I guess the insight that I would gain is that they viewed the world so differently. One Sunday morning, I sat up straight. The United States was being prayed for, and members of my church were very concerned. This was shortly after the election. Members of my church were very concerned about where the United States was and where it was going, and so I learned something by listening to my elders pray. I think maybe that was an insight I wish I had learned earlier in my ministry, that when I did the praying for the church, I stopped learning about where people were. The prayers were insights into where my church members were, where my leaders were. I think that early on I wish more people from the congregation had participated at that moment in worship.
Strikes me that this theme of pastoral imagination is not in any way restricted to the person whose job title is pastor. That in every church there are lay people who have powerful intuitions that are profoundly pastoral in relating to different members of the congregation, the needs of the world expressed in that prayer. Say a little bit about that, the way pastoral imagination might be distributed throughout a congregation and expressed in that way.
You know, in my experience, I worked with a lead pastor who had considerable pastoral experience, and that was so good in my life. But I remember reading in one of Eugene Peterson's books about I guess the only church that he served in his ministry career. There were no lead pastors there for him to turn to, so he identified a member of his congregation, and I think it was a person who worked with his hands, a plumber, a carpenter, and he said, "I want you to be my spiritual director." And I know there's a difference between spiritual director and mentor. But Eugene Peterson knew at that point in his ministry that he needed to have somebody that he could turn to who would not hesitate to say a difficult word at the right time. And he, as I said, he said to him, "I want you to be that person in my life." I think I had one of those people early on that year of internship in Iowa. There was a member of the church who was a faculty member at the University of Iowa, taught early childhood education. I mean, maybe not the person you would pick out to be my mentor, but as it turned out, he was just the right person at the right time in my life to say the words I needed to hear. I'm a big believer in the power of those mentoring relationships.
Beautiful. Say a little bit about, we'd like to explore a theme you've written about actually too, right? A lot of writings around the theme of vocation, and we've talked about some of the moments of vocational discernment, that moment of getting ready to move to Zurich as a key moment. Say a little bit about the vocation of moving into a retirement phase and the vocational really work and discernment that you've done as a part of that. What insights or lessons do you have about that dimension?
Well, interestingly, John, I've just written about that. I've reached the high point in my ministry career. I'm now a columnist for my town newspaper, Holland, Michigan, the Holland Sentinel. And I just turned in a piece on retirement. So what I did was to get my book off the shelf and to see if it still made sense. I knew a great deal about being a young adult and looking for a vocation. I knew a great deal about vocation at midlife. Looking back, I think the chapter on older adulthood was kind of thin. I think my keenest insight about vocation for older adults was that there's no word for retirement in the Bible. So I tried to embellish on that a bit for my newspaper column. And so here's where I came out, and I would be curious to know where you are in this or what you think about it. I think vocation doesn't change. It may evolve over time. I don't think it changes. I think that my vocation in retirement is pretty much what it has always been. I mean, I think I've been called or gifted to communicate the faith. I've been called to enter into pastoral relationships with the people I come across. I have a number of these specific callings which have not come to an end because I stopped receiving pay from a church. I want to continue to do what I've always done, and I continue to find joy in that.
Beautiful, beautiful. Go ahead.
I was going to talk about my long walk.
Go for it. Go for it.
As John knows, I took a long walk in March. I hiked the Camino de Santiago, and there are several paths to Santiago, but I took the way of St. James, the oldest one, so I started on the French side of the Pyrenees and hiked to Santiago de Compostela. Well, just about everybody you meet along the way will tell you, I'm not religious. I'm not doing this for religious reasons. So I immediately fell into pastor mode for the 29 days I was on this path with just about every person I met. So I'm not a religious person. Okay. But then we would talk as we walked along, and as it turned out, the person I was talking with didn't see it right away, but every person I walked with was walking for a spiritual reason. It was clearly spiritual to me. And as their unofficial pastor, I found that my role in those situations was to help them see that what they were doing was deeply spiritual, and that they had a spiritual longing, and that they were doing this because they had the spiritual longing. So I didn't receive any pay for having walked as a pastor, but that's what I did. And so I've been continuing my call.
It does occur to me that learning to recognize that as deeply spiritual, learning to interpret it in that way, is a beautiful gift and insight and way of being.
Can I give you an example about that? So the high point of the Camino de Santiago, the high point in terms of elevation, is something called the Cruz de Ferro. So it's a very simple cross, and over the centuries, this pilgrimage dates back to maybe the 9th century. Over the centuries, pilgrims have taken a stone from home, and then they've left it at the foot of this cross at the top of a mountain. And the idea is that the stone symbolizes some sin or guilt, some burden that they want to leave at Jesus' feet. Well, I mean, I understand that to be a profoundly religious act, but here were all the friends I had made, the fellow pilgrims walking together. Number one, they knew exactly what to do. The group became quiet at the foot of this mountain. We walked up single file. I mean, no one handed out a worship bulletin to show us how to do this. We walked up single file. We placed the stone. I didn't want to take a stone. My backpack was already heavy. I took a piece of Lake Michigan driftwood. Don't judge me. And so everyone laid their burden at the foot of the cross. There was a time of silence, and then we would move on. And I was standing at the foot of this mountain of stones. A lot of stones had accumulated over 10 centuries. I was thinking, there's a human need to engage in this kind of behavior. Right? There's a human need to let our burdens go. Right? And so someone needs to say something about what just happened there. So we had several hours of walking to do, and I found myself the rest of that day saying, this is what people of faith do. Right?
Part of what no doubt happened on that pilgrimage were encounters with people from so many different contexts. And I think about our work with this grants program, that there are encounters with churches that are so remarkably different. Socioeconomic dimensions, cultural dimensions, denominational traditions. So many times when we gather in church groups and we say, oh, it's ecumenical, it actually is a group of people who are really alike in a certain way, but from different traditions. But to really break out and to experience the breadth, the diversity, in ways that can sometimes be unsettling. I mean, that's a dimension of the work we've been about these years. Can you say a little bit about that, your appreciation for challenges along the way in this ever-expanding ecumenical conversation, what that's been like for you as a Presbyterian pastor?
Yeah, I think it began with my mom and dad, who took me around the world, and with the idea of developing a gift of curiosity. I think I became curious at an early age because my mom and dad took me into settings and situations that were very different from Southeast Grand Rapids, which is where I grew up. So I've taken this curiosity into my ministry. I wonder if one of the obstacles to becoming a truly and authentically multicultural church isn't a lack of curiosity about the people around us, the people who live in our neighborhoods. Are we curious about the language they speak? Are we curious about the issues that they face? Last night we heard about ICE and the fear of deportation and so on. I wonder if we know our people, the people who live among us, well enough to know what it is that they are afraid of. So because my mom and dad gave me this gift of curiosity, I've spent my life eager to learn from people who are very different from me. And I'll give one example. Again, this is from my Camino de Santiago in March. I was walking one day with a man named Sebastian, a 50-year-old Jesuit priest from Chile. And as soon as he introduced himself to me as a Jesuit priest, I said, "Oh, good sermons." He said, "Not always." But we came to know each other in a wonderful way over the next 24-hour period or so. As it turns out, Sebastian is a teacher in Siberia. He runs a small theological school somewhere in Siberia. Even though he's from Chile, his superiors said, where you need to be, he had a PhD in biblical theology, where you need to be is Siberia. So he is leading a school. I think there may be a half dozen students. He's the president and academic dean, and he's the entire faculty and the basketball coach of his theological school. And so as we walked together, I pressed him on that idea of vocation. When the opportunity for me came along to go to Switzerland, I needed no arm twisting. I thought surely the Lord would want me in Zurich, Switzerland. But what if the Lord had said, somewhere in Siberia, at a theological school that no one has ever heard of, would I be willing to go there? And I mean, that was the theme that afternoon in my own devotional study. And I have to say, I think the first answer would have been, no way. I do not see myself in Siberia. So my friend Sebastian speaks Spanish, that's his native language, English, French, and then in order to do the work that he does in Siberia, he's a fluent Russian speaker. I mean, all to do this work that God has called him to do. I'm in awe.
Part of what I love, notice this pattern, as you tell a story, you'll say something happened, and then I thought about it all afternoon. I think that's a gift. I thought about it all afternoon needs to be named as one of the marks of a wise pastor. What do you think?
If you're walking 17 miles a day, you have a lot of time to think.
Yeah, right. A couple final questions, and then we'll open it up for a bit of other questions that others may have here. Along the way, Doug, have there been books, authors, people that really have been influential that you'd like to celebrate and bless, that you think, wow, that really made a difference in my work and ministry? It's probably a very long list, but...
We didn't talk about this question, John.
No.
So I've gone through the difficult, painful experience of culling my library in retirement. 90% of it had to go. And I gave some to my daughter, who's a Presbyterian pastor, and she wasn't exactly as joyful as I fantasized she would be about receiving my theological collection. So 90% of it had to go. But the books that I kept include some favorite novelists. And I've discovered over the years that it's the novelists who've informed my preaching and made my preaching vocabulary more interesting than it otherwise would be. But then there are other theologians, spiritual writers out there whose books I've also kept. So there are 4 or 5 books from various authors. Eugene Peterson, I've already mentioned him. He has had an influence, a profound influence in my life, and I thought, okay, he's a Presbyterian, and I'm a Presbyterian, and that's what being a faithful Presbyterian pastor looks like. I can, model myself after that. Will Willimon, not a Presbyterian, but a courageous thinker, and someone I very much admired. This one is sort of embarrassing, and yet I'm going to tell you anyway. Anne Lamott. So when I first read Anne Lamott, I thought, oh, this is such honesty. But what is it about Anne Lamott's writing that makes people want to read her? It's not just surprising honesty. It's disarming honesty. Anyway, in-your-face honesty. And so when I read her, I thought, she is communicating the faith in a way that I need to learn. And if I could have just a fraction of the honesty in my preaching that I find in her writing, I am going to be a better preacher. I think I better stop the library.
Okay, all right. As you conclude your time of service on our grants board, any wisdom or advice that you want to make sure that you share with us? Any particular hopes or dreams that you'd have for this work going forward? Any word that you'd want to make sure to get in?
Thanks. You can't fire me now, so I'm just going to let it rip. When I became pastor of the church in Zurich, the outgoing pastor, the retiring pastor, preached the sermon at my installation. And when he finished, he came and sat down next to me and said, "Have a ball. Have a ball." And so last night, as we were walking off the stage, it looked like a police lineup with the board members up front. When we came off stage, I said to the newest member of the grants board, "Have a ball." I mean, you are going to have more fun, and you'll receive more joy in doing this work than you can possibly imagine. So is that wisdom? No, it's a blessing.
All right, well, that's good. That's good. Any questions or comments? Time for perhaps 1 or 2 from those of you who are here. Go ahead.
So beyond writing the book during your time in Zurich, how did you navigate some of those difficulties in ministering to such a multicultural congregation different from your experience?
Yeah, good question. When I was writing that book, I realized that there was little out there. There were a couple of academic books and one academic journal article, and I leaned heavily on those in the writing of my book, but there were very few other resources out there. I've since discovered that at the time I was writing mine, a person in the UK wrote a similar book, and so there's an academic journal that's coming out, and reviews of our books are going to be placed side by side. I wish I had known about that book before I wrote my own. So in addition to reading, which is how I usually try to understand things, before my first child was born, I read a book on parenting. I mean, that's how I learned to do things, even though reading a book about parenting is totally unhelpful. So I began to talk to people, and as I said earlier, I began to listen. I tried to find people who were also leading multicultural congregations, and I belong to an association of international churches in Europe and the Middle East. So we had these annual gatherings, and we talked frequently together about our struggles in ministry. So besides the books and articles I read, it would be these conversations with other ministry leaders that were most helpful, especially those who had done it for a long, long time. I hope that's
Good. Anyone else? All right. Well, Doug, thank you. Love the conversation. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you for the writing. Those of us in West Michigan look forward to reading the Holland Sentinel. The number of subscriptions might go up, actually, to make sure we get the Doug Brouwer column. Thank you so much. And let's all join together in saying thanks to Doug for his time.